All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Juan. I'm here to talk about DeSci. I want to talk about how we can use DeSci to fund, organize, and open science. First off, this is what we're going to be talking through. I'm going to talk about science in general for a moment. Then I'm going to talk about what the DeSci movement is. Then about how we can fund the science commons. Then how DeSci is organizing the people, the projects, and the works around science. Then I want to speak a little bit about open access and reproducible science, and I want to finish with a call to action. So this will be pretty quick. We'll have a lot to cover, so I'll move fast. First off, I want to start by saying that there's been an enormous amount of progress in the last few centuries. Humanity has been improving by almost any measure that we can think of. The human condition has been improving dramatically, and a big part of achieving this progress has been the scientific enterprise. So by extending what we know, by being able to transform what we know into technologies and solutions to various problems, we have been able to lift a huge fraction of the world out of poverty. We've been able to feed tons of people, give shelter to everybody, cure all kinds of diseases, and so on. So an enormous amount of progress has been achieved thanks to science. Science is a massive enterprise with lots of different subfields, many different areas of knowledge. You can think of any particular field and any area of study and so on. Science is a big part of it. At the end of the day, what science is about is the process of finding things out, the process of creating new knowledge and coupling new concepts. So think of the scientific method and so on. There's a famous quote from Feynman: "If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong," and in that is the key to science. You can think of science as a large-scale enterprise that involves humans around the planet. There's all kinds of efforts and systems and so on. Think of everything from various universities around the planet, various research groups, different fields and journals and so on. Lots of different activity around the process of synthesizing what we know, coming up with new ideas, transforming those ideas into research projects, turning those into actual testing and of hypotheses, and creating gathering of data to be able to test whether a hypothesis is correct, and so on, all the way through writing up those results into some kind of paper that then gets reviewed by scientific community, gets added to the tree of knowledge, and then extends what we know. And maybe the story stops there, or maybe later it turns out that hey, actually that wasn't reproducible, and we have to unwind that, or hey, actually that was correct, but it opened up the door to tons of other new knowledge. So it's a highly dynamic field, lots of different activity, and so on. Now, science has a ton of problems. There's all kinds of issues with the scientific enterprise, even though it has been an enormous engine for progress. There's all kinds of things that have been going wrong with it. In particular, there's lack of funding across a variety of fields. At the same time, even though there's a lack of funding, there is a lot of money overall going to science. There's a feeling that the money is not going as far as it used to, that science is not getting as much for its buck anymore. There are many the fields across the board are way too competitive in terms of getting grants. Then once the studies are done and produced and so on, only a fraction of those replicates. So there's all kinds of science that has been published and accepted and thought to be correct, only to find out later that a huge fraction of it can't actually be reproduced, so it's not even correct. So there's a huge reproducibility crisis. And there's even scientific discoveries whose artifacts are going missing. So think of the actual papers or the code or the data associated with some result going missing from our knowledge banks and so on. So there's all kinds of issues around science that need to be fixed. And this is part of what DeSci is about. So DeSci is tackling a range of these problems, not wholesale and not completely, but the DeSci community is trying to tackle a number of these issues, starting with some parts and trying to scale solutions. Great, so what's DeSci? DeSci is a movement to improve science using Web3 tech and tools. So think of being able to use all of the magic of hash linking and blockchains and so on, and smart contracts to create systems and structures that can improve how we do science across fields, around the globe, and so on. There's a bunch of different focus areas, so think of just being able to have open access papers and data and data commons, to having better reproducible experiments, being able to kind of organize labs and groups better. So think of creating structures like DAOs and so on that can enable research groups to form and organize and raise capital and distribute rewards to participants and so on. There's new entire funding structures, things like IPNFTs and so on. There's protocols for peer review with rewards. Historically, peer review has been this kind of predatory situation where lots of academics put in an enormous amount of time and effort to peer review all of the work, and journals don't actually pay anyone for that labor. And there's all kinds of new incentive structures that are being experimented with and so on. So there's a fairly new movement. It has been with us for a while. When I started IPFS, it was kind of a DeSci movement before DeSci was a thing. I started IPFS with a goal of enabling people to distribute data much better for the purpose of doing science. So a lot of these ideas are part of what the core of the project. However, the movement has been picking up a lot of steam over the last year or two, and a lot of new organizations have been appearing. So this map has, I think, like doubled or tripled in size in the last year, which is really great to see. There's all kinds of new organizations coming into the ecosystem. There's now several groups doing decentralized biotech funding, groups like VitaDAO and Molecule and others. There's many organizations trying to come up with new structures for funding science. There's several DAOs that are like scientific organizations themselves and trying to do R&D, different kind of research and so on. There's several foundations and institutions that are supporting a lot of the DeSci work or that associate themselves with DeSci in one way or another. There's many groups exploring different ways of doing publishing, many science NFTs, and so on. And so this is a community that is growing a lot, has been growing a lot over the last few year or two. There's also now a lot of different meetups and conferences and so on that are gathering these communities, things like DeSci Day or DeSci someplace like DeSci Berlin. Shelling Point from the Gitcoin community are funding the Commons. These conferences are gathering a lot of the conversations around DeSci. So let's talk about funding the Commons. Maybe some of you have seen this diagram that I've used in the past around the innovation chasm, where this kind of the science to technology translation. So in the science part or DeSci part, it's mostly focused on the left part, just the science part, and trying to think of better incentive structures, better ways of coordinating groups to produce better scientific output. It's worth noting that the total global R&D funding is both, from one perspective kind of massive, but on the other perspective, not that large and hasn't changed that much in the last few decades, even though the kind of throughput and outcome of the technology that we're building has grown tremendously. So these kinds of funding scales are not outside of the reach of blockchains. So my guess, think of the US non-defense R&D is kind of on the order of like 70 billion a year, which is a lot for sure. But it's not massive. Even just isolating NSF, which is kind of around 10 billion a year. It's kind of like the red part in the bottom of the graph. That is totally achievable through blockchains. So think of now the crypto space having on the order of like a trillion to 3 trillion, depending on when you look at it. And think of a system that's able to so imagine if blockchains were to devote some fraction of their supply to R&D on a yearly basis. Imagine taking like 1% of Filecoin or Ethereum or Bitcoin or something like that and pouring it into R&D every year. You start hitting the numbers that are starting to get in range of funding science at a nation-state level. So if crypto grows by another order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude, and we have those kinds of structures, crypto is going to be able to fund R&D and science at the scale of nation states, which is pretty crazy to think about. So it'd be great to figure out the structures and figure out good funding pathways ahead of when we get there. So when you start breaking down funding, down from those agencies and so on, you encounter all kinds of problems. Things like certain fields being under, with too little attention, or way too, the programs themselves being having kind of perverse incentives in certain structures, or being like way too competitive, or yielding a condition where scientists are spending an enormous amount of their time just writing grants. There was this effort called the FAST grants around COVID, and was replicated, the same effect was replicated in the impetus grants and so on, where these programs just structured a grant program that was very, very fast, that was able to give out grants on the order of anywhere from 20K to 200K or more, with a tiny fraction of the amount of time that scientists were putting in instead. And just this is the results of one survey from the FAST grants program that shows kind of how much time, this is kind of a survey from scientists that were applying for those grants, how much time they normally spend applying for grants. Think of 25 to 50% of their time, of a scientist's time, just going to spelling out what they're doing and applying to various different grants. That's kind of insane. Ideally, you would want scientists to spend the vast majority of their time thinking about their work and coming up with new ideas and analyzing their work and so on. There's also this other effect that happens, which is that grant programs tend to constrain what people end up exploring. Many scientists have much more ambitious research agendas, but they're not able to pursue them because they're not able to get funding for them. And so they end up stuck pursuing all kinds of other work that is not nearly as impactful as perhaps their work might be, but they end up following that structure because of the grant programs. So Web3 public goods to the rescue. There's a lot of different groups, and of course, this is tiny still. The Web3 movement is very small compared to global science R&D funding. But if we can get the structures right, and we can align the incentives well, and we can demonstrate that it works, then we can scale it. So then we can scale it by orders of magnitude along with crypto. So that's why this stuff can be pretty important. So we should explore many different kinds of funding for scientific processes, so many different grant programs, things like impact certificates, impact markets, and so on. There's a whole exploration happening now across many different structures. The Funding in the Commons community has been sampling a bunch of different mechanisms and so on. A lot of this stuff is now on YouTube. You can go and explore a bunch of the ideas there. And just to give you an example, there's groups like VitaDAO that are creating a DAO structure that are giving out grants to groups in exchange for data and knowledge and IP. Then they're bundling that IP into IP NFTs that carry legal weight. And they're using those with then granting IP rights to biotechs. And then they're going to be funding those biotechs and aiming to return investment through the success of those biotech companies. So they're creating this kind of there's a structure for this kind of fund. I tend to call it a fundamental development fund, which is trying to do and fund a bunch of important work through labs that are not themselves companies, with the goal of generating IP and then using that IP to fund companies. Then there's groups like Molecule who are creating marketplaces for that kind of work to happen, either those kinds of grants or that kind of IP NFT generation. Certificates of impact are another fascinating structure that enables you to do these kind of retroactive funding where you enable participants to, once they achieve some impact, mint a certificate around that impact and sell it in a market to anybody that wants to claim that impact. That enables a speculative market to emerge around that impact. So you're able to then close a loop across time and be able to kind of retroactively fund extremely important work. This is extremely crucial because many times you only realize how valuable something is long after the work has been done. So think of some important research that leads into some really important discovery, and only 5 or 10 years later do you realize that was a fundamentally deep and important contribution. And so think of impact certificates as being able to generate cash flows that can sort of move back in time. Great, so that's kind of, a whole bunch of experimentation is happening around funding. Still, very significant already in several fields. There are many groups that are now kind of either entirely funded by these things or starting to. But this can scale now to much larger levels where many more participants can if we can prove this works, we can then scale it to whole industries. So now, some quick thoughts about organizing people. So in the past, like the GitHub has been tremendously successful as just helping organize lots of scientific discovery. There have been entire textbooks and fields developed through GitHub. There's a great book called Reinventing Discovery that kind of goes into this kind of thing. Many groups have just used the very basic primitives of GitHub around issues and code collaboration and so on, and version control, to organize communities of practice and communities of science and so on. So that's all really good. But what isn't complete there is you don't have a way of creating organizations that do research. You don't have any kind of way of dealing with capital. You don't have any way of paying contributors and so on. So the same kind of structures and problems that open source development has. So there's some interesting experiments. So things like there's a LabDAO group that is creating kind of lab teams where teams can form around a group, use the DAO tooling and blockchain tooling to then be able to raise funding and then distribute it to participants. You're able to kind of encode the different levels of contribution of different participants to be able to reward them fairly. There are more ambitious projects of being able to then start thinking about the credit assignment across participants in a larger network, being able to think of various different teams and how they might couple and be able to propagate reward across them. There are groups that are experimenting with peer review. So think of whole peer review protocols being proposed where you start thinking about the economics and the dynamics of the peer review system, and you arrive at a way to both incentivize that work or rather properly, because it's already happening, but rather properly rewarding the fact that that work is happening. There's a protocol called Ants Review that is doing this already, and you can find a demo you can like run it. You can use MetaMask and so on, which is pretty sweet. Worth mentioning as well that Gitcoin Grants has pioneered a ton of the work that can be used here, and is already supporting a lot of tooling for participants that want to organize in these ways. I mentioned earlier that IPFS started with this goal. IPFS has been used for a lot of the dataset building and distribution and so on. One of the really key components here is that you can link content by hash. You can freeze some bundle of information, get a content address, hash link it, and then be able to kind of reference things. So think of that as the core primitive that you want in literature anyway. So when you have a citation from one paper to another paper, or from a paper to its data, or from a paper to some important code that you need in order to regenerate the data, a CID is precisely the thing you want. You imagine being able to sort of freeze the entire literature with version control, and being able to freeze all the important data sets and code required to be able to run those experiments again. There's many groups that are exploring this kind of thing. There's many groups that have proposed different ways of doing kind of peer review and science development through IPFS. A number of these projects, I think, are getting off the ground. And then you can think of bundling that kind of activity and that kind of data generation with something called a data DAO. These are new, so unlike the DAOs that I mentioned before, which are just already getting started, data DAOs are very new. There aren't that many of them yet. But think of a group that is able to create, collect, curate, transform, and compute on data, and then govern how that data is used over time, govern how it's monetized, and figure out how it gets shared. Some final notes on open access and reproducible science. IPFS has been used already a ton for many kinds of open science work. It's already kind of like living the dream of opening up access to a lot of science. So think of everything from like the distributed Wikipedia copies to there's massive archives of papers distributed through IPFS already. There's all kinds of data sets and facilities and so on moved this way. So it's already enabling an open data commons. And there's already people trying to use it for this reproducibility. We're not quite there yet here. This is an area that needs more work. But a lot of people have already done the thinking of how to do it. So there's really good specs and ideas around how to take a lot of the work around standard reproducibility and use IPFS to freeze all of these assets and be able to get to fully reproducible pipeline where you can kind of summon back like specific experiments from the past and be like, oh, we want to rerun that and make sure that it works. And you can bring back totally frozen VMs or containers or functions that you can rerun all the data pipelines and verify that the experiments are correct. There's also a whole other angle around doing the data science itself in this DeSci-oriented way, where the actual notebooks and the data analysis and the artifacts and so on that you're using are using all these Web3 powered applications. The first few are starting to do this. There are things like Jupyter notebooks and IPython notebooks and Wolfram notebooks that already couple with CIDs, so you can start referencing all of these kinds of things. But I think that's going to get supercharged in the future as now. So the Filecoin network is growing tremendously. It's adding an enormous amount of data, and the Filecoin network has a lot of storage coupled with compute. So you have these storage providers that have tons of GPUs right next to the data. So those are going to get wired up in the next year with the ability to then issue computational pipelines around that data. So think of now being able to generate a platform for scientists to be able to do data science at massive scale, leveraging Web3 computing platforms, so both the addressing of information, the storage of information, and then the computation of that information, to have a full end-to-end pipeline of data science at pretty large scale. Finally, a quick call to action. Science is the engine of progress. By extending what we know, we're able to produce more technology and improve our lives. If we can improve the lives of scientists and make their work easier, if we can accelerate their development, if we can cut down some of their costs, if we can enable them to spend more of their time figuring out the problems, then we can all as a society advance much faster. So the DeSci movement needs you. Think of either experimenting with new funding mechanisms or building open access tooling, building open science tooling. Think of playing around with all these kind of public data or public data sets that are being accumulated. Think of joining a DeSci team or a DAO. Go back to that diagram and kind of explore those communities. And hope to see you in the movement. Thank you very much, and see you around.